Javier Rivera runs a YouTube channel covering dating, family, and Islamic thought. I thought it'd be really good today to have a conversation about the fall from the perspective of Islam, and then maybe comparing to Christianity and the other sort of people of the book who subscribe to the tale of the fallen in various form. You've been nice enough to kind of flag up Iqbal's interpretation from an Islamic perspective of the fall. For someone like me who, inevitably comes at these things from a more Christian perspective, could you just kind of walk me through the fall as it's seen from Islam?
So Iqbal's kind of like, it's best probably not to start from Iqbal's perspective, because he is bringing philosophy into it, and he's also sort of a mystic. So just to give you, like, if you were to just approach a Muslim, just a regular Muslim, and they were to tell you about the fall, they would just say that they would do a couple corrections. One is that Satan is not an angel. Satan is a jinn made of fire. So that's a significant kind of thing to note. So it's not an angel that betrayed God. It's a jinn. And then the other thing is the whole rib thing from Adam into Eve, that is completely omitted. So that's not there. If you go through a couple of the verses from the Quran, and it's in various places, so the Quran is not really in a, it's really good to know this, that it's not in a sort of linear order. Mm-hmm. You'll find verses talking about the fall, in one section, and then in another section, and then maybe towards the back or in the middle. It's kind of spread out through the Quran itself. And it adds like a little bit more each time, or whatever. So, but basically, again, so it omits the rib and story. It omits the whole apple idea. The only thing that you get is that Satan tempted, actually it doesn't even, Satan tempted Adam. And then the only glimpse you get of Eve is you don't even get a name, Eve. You get Adam, go down to earth with you and your wife. Like you go down there with you and your wife. So it doesn't explicitly say Eve. But we're kind of assuming Eve. and the reason why we're kind of assuming Eve is because, one, the Islamic narration, the Islamic perspective is that the Quran came down to affirm everything that came previously. So it's supposed to be the affirmation of all the scriptures before it, meaning Judaism, Christianity, and so on. But again, this is the traditional conception that the Quran is there to sort of correct the errors or the distortions that happened during those times. So you could say some Muslims would argue that the reason why the Quran omits the rib story, whatever, is because that ends up being just a distortion of what happened. Again, I don't know, because it's interesting, because I feel like you could look at it both ways, because it's kind of silent on the thing, right? You could say, well, it's either that it omits it completely, or that it's saying that actually it's a true part of the story, so it just continues on. But the only correction you see is that actually Satan is not an angel. He's a jinn. So there's that way to look at it, and that's basically the traditional conception, and then also there is no, and this is important too, is that there's no concept of original sin.
Mm. Mm.
So yeah, it's basically like Adam begs for forgiveness, he gets forgiven, and then that's it. There's nothing about like the will being corrupted or so on. So there is no concept of original sin in the Islamic narrative.
Right. And the word jinn is something like spirit, right?
So jinn, so this was actually very interesting when I first learned about this. So jinn are basically, there's a parallel realm called jinn. They basically have the same amount of freedom that we do as human beings. Is just we're kind of like barred from each other. But apparently, we can make contact with them and so on. They're almost want to, it's weird because you almost want to say like demons,
Mm-hmm.
but apparently there's good and bad jinn. The problem is that Muslims tell you not to mess with it because you don't know what type of jinn you'll get in contact with. So yeah, that's kind of like the interesting part. So you don't really get any like demon aspect. You just get like there's followers. There's actually good jinn that follow the Quran. That's
Right.
actually what you get from one of the Quran verses, is that there's a specific time period where the jinn were listening to the Quran being recited.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's really it. The jinn are made of fire, and they have like almost the same freedom as we do.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because it does functionally, I mean, obviously, there's the specific descriptions are different, but it does functionally serve a similar purpose to the angels of Christianity, right? Because as you said, they're kind of on a different plane, but we're able to commune with them if that's allowed to happen, and they have free choice. That's why there's fallen angels, why Satan's seen as a fallen angel in Christianity, and that's part of free choice as well. So it's interesting how the metaphor and functional purpose of these concepts is shared, but the substantive element changes. I know it's not the case in all of this, and we'll get into that, but it is interesting how the core is functionally the same.
Yeah, it's like the angels, like it's funny because like the Muslims will say like, oh no, the angels can't disobey at all. They have complete submission. So and it's the reason why that is, you could say, is the Muslims will argue it's the fact that man has free will is why man is technically superior than the angels, because everything else that is in God's like kind of like realm has to submit to him. They have no choice.
Mm-hmm.
We're the first like beings, but it's like we're the first beings plus jinn that can do this. But then Satan does that funny thing where he's like, oh, but I'm made of fire, so I'm better than him. And then he makes that mistake. And he also tempts Adam. And well, yeah, it's funny because yeah, he tempts Adam and then.
So something that's quite central to all of this, not talking about the specifics of the story, but just in Islam in general, there not being an equivalent concept of original sin, which I think is incredibly central. And I think this goes for Judaism as well, right? It's not conceived in the same way as it is in Christianity. In terms of the role that plays in the religion's outlook, what do you think the central difference is with that? And is there there's haram things in Islam, right? There are like what you might think of as sinful or bad things, right? So I'm wondering what the functional like difference is between original sin and sins generally.
So this is so this is like what's gonna, like, a lot of people would have theological debates about, but from the Islamic narrative is that basically it's, I think so. I'm going to use Shuan as like my kind of like figure to extract this, because very few people can metaphysically abstract what exactly is the difference. And Shuan abstracts it in the sense that, so for Christianity, will is corrupted, but will is also intelligence. So it's will as intelligence and then as man. So if the will is corrupted, that means man's intelligence is corrupted and his will. So they're both the same. And that's why you need the sacrament, you need the sacrifice, you need Jesus. But for Islam, the argument is that intelligence comes before will, and that, which has been a hotly debated topic between Christians and Muslims, because they're like saying, how can you determine which is which? But I think the way to look at it is, and I've had to kind of dissect this myself. I was actually talking to Daniel about this, OG Rose, and his wife about this for a long time last night. I want to say the difference lies in the points of departure. The reason why the Muslim can't understand the Christian is because he only sees God and the world. That's it, right? You can't put a sort of type of mediator other than like the messenger. But for Christianity, it's God through Christ world. So it's like almost like a, like a tunnel going through from God to Christ and to the world. So it's Christ basically embodies the whole, the relative towards absolute. Mm-hmm. And Muslims have a hard time grappling with that, because one of the testimonies of faith to become a Muslim is there's only one God, meaning we can't take any anthropomorphic conception of God because it's absolute. There's just, we can't know God, we can't fathom God, so it's just absolute. And so to understand why, and this is kind of putting my interpretation on it, because I feel like most Muslims wouldn't know, because they don't like metaphysically abstract this stuff, is that actually Christianity's departure is when man gets created. So will and intelligence, that is the same. And it's true, you can't, it's really hard to argue which one comes first. And Daniel talked to me about this, the will can resist the intelligence, and so on and so on. But the Muslim takes it from the God's perspective, meaning that if God is all knowing, he can't just act without knowing, because then he's not God. So then intelligence comes first. And because God made it, man is made in the image of God, they kind of just reciprocally go that intelligence came first before will.
Yeah, and that whole idea of intelligence being the second thing in Christianity is pretty evident from the text as well. Like, it's explicitly said that the tree, like the actual tree and the apple of Christianity contain, like, okay, it says specifically knowledge of good and evil in Genesis, but it's still knowledge, right?
Yeah.
But it's interesting to hear that different sort of theological view on that thing.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what's your interest in this subject in Islam? Is it a personal faith, or is it just out of interest?
It was a personal faith for a while, but I think my main interest is that it's such a vastly misunderstood religion, just in general. It's probably one of the biggest religions that are so vastly misunderstood. Like, it's crazy how even Muslims themselves don't even understand it. And there's such cultural differentiations within Islam itself that you could go to so many different Muslim countries, and I'm putting quotes here, that it would just all be different. Um, and and it's funny because most Muslims believe that that is what the faith is, even though there's cultural leakage all in there, and it's hard to determine because you are born into it. It's not until you kind of have like an outsider perspective and just look at, basically the doctrine and the theory, that you start thinking, well, that's weird. Doesn't make any sense. Um, and I feel like, Islam is not really something that, people in the United States are gonna specifically talk about. It's not necessarily the predominant religion, and most people are just kind of content with just either not knowing about it or just having the conception that they have. So I took it upon myself to kind of just be like, make content, learn more about it, kind of fix the misunderstandings. I think that's kind of like really what I'm passionate about, is try to fix the misunderstandings, because I feel like a lot of people's kind of like resentment or repulsion is perhaps misunderstood. So that's really my position right now.
Yeah, I just find it a really interesting question when someone's intellectually interested in these sort of theological, or I guess you might come from like a Jungian angle and say it's more psychological or mythological. I don't consider myself now ever really been a Christian, but it's obviously, I think it's obviously what I know the most about, just because that's kind of the culture I come from. But I still feel a weird sort of pull towards these topics, and it definitely started with Christianity, and actually for me specifically, getting into Milton, because I almost, like, if I had to choose like a religious perspective, I'd almost like consider the Milton texts as my like kind of Bible. But that's more of a taste thing. But yeah, it's weird though, because now trying to understand something like Islam that I've had, like preconceptions and prejudices, that just ties into politics and how we consume information. I think it is interesting to notice there is, especially because these are religions of the book, but that there is these great similarities, and from a philosophical perspective you can almost view them as tools for viewing the world in a certain way, which talk about metaphysics, this stuff has downstream effects, right? The Christian interpretation of the fall is a toolkit in one sense, and is good at some things and maybe not, and maybe misunderstands others, and then maybe the Islamic interpretation is a toolkit in the same way. I don't know if you agree with that, but
I mean, I do, because I actually did a video today and I basically said that the reason why people argue over Freud and Jung so much is that my opinion is that Freud takes it as man himself is fallen, will corrupted, and Jung takes it as that the human being is a theomorphic being, which is what Islam takes. But I want to correct one aspect, though, is that Christians will still accept the idea of a theomorphic being, because you're supposed to find a new Jerusalem, and the whole idea of like there's a kingdom of God inside of you. If you anthropomorphize God, that also inversely makes you a theomorphic being. But the problem is with Freud is that he takes the idea of fallen man without God, and he says, well, how do you deal with that? This is why you get all of his theories about sex, violence, neurosis. This is all sort of predicates and summarizations of what happened in the Garden of Eden. They deduce it to like a sexual disobeying kind of thing. And so his whole theory is basically built off of that, while simultaneously rejecting the existence of God.
I think it comes out, not, I think Freud is a really good example there in terms of someone you could think of like as philosophical, but obviously psychological. But I think this comes out in so many different ways in, like, for example, political viewpoints. Like, I think because, and maybe this is just speaking to what I know about, but I think in the West, definitely, because as much as we might deny it, there's this constant kind of background noise of Christianity just because of the impact it's had. I feel like, you know, that gets taken to extremes in political views, you know, with extreme like mindless altruism, which is kind of a weird misjudging of what Christ was talking about, what he was all about. And I don't know, it makes me wonder if the same as maybe, I mean, I guess Islam still has much more of a hold in the places in the world where that's present, I think, generally speaking.
Well, the thing is, like, it's weird because my perspective on the Islam is that I really want to get away from Islam being this sort of narrow religion, because I feel, I mean, I really do feel like Islam is actually a universal religion, but not in the sense of like everybody follow this religion. I'm talking about, it's a very abstract notion, and I'm going to tell you what I mean by how abstract it is. Okay, so Islam, the actual word itself, means submission to God. Muslims means those who submit to God, right? If we abstract that, those who believe in some type of absolute have that same religion. Mm-hmm. But the thing that gets confusing is that people go, oh, well, they don't believe in like Prophet Muhammad, and they don't believe in all this other stuff. Well, the thing is, they also don't believe in the other prophets. And I'm going to tell you how abstract this is, because look, there's a verse in the Quran that says, I send prophets from east to the west. And then there's prophets that are not named because there's like a crap ton of them. And what this would mean is that actually, if we entertain this idea seriously, that means Buddha's possibly a prophet. We have the, you know, whatever, all the more, you know, like ancient Eastern religions, most of their people are probably like prophets themselves. I have Nasser. Nasser is one of the like perennialist Iranian philosophers. Muslims disagree with him, but he would argue that Plato was a philosopher and Pythagoras was Plato was a prophet and Pythagoras was a prophet. Because they're asking you to basically acknowledge this absolute. And the Quran says all the messengers that we've ever sent is one simple message, that you worship the one and only, the absolute. The thing is, we call it by so many different things, which, I mean, if I want to take it seriously, from my interpretation, is that this allows for universality and difference. You know, people would fucking kill me if I said this, you know, because they just, and I think I think the big problem with Christianity and Islam is that people worship the law, like the law in their own texts, so much that actually I almost want to say that you have no concept of actually worshiping God anymore. Because you are just worshiping the law. And so you get this cold, rigid, heartless, just nothing. I mean, it's crazy. And this is why you get towards the 5th and 6th centuries of Islam, Sufism bursts out, which is more like you could say it's more like the lovey-dovey mystics, and they're all about, they talk about love more than the law.
Mm.
And they look at Jesus as one of the primordial figures for kind of getting closer to God, because they look at Jesus as like the path of love to get to God. And there's a lot of Sufis that write poems about Jesus because they feel like he embodies this pathway to love. And they believe it's also the quickest. And if we even go back to the Bhagavad Gita, which is called the Song of God, ironically, right? Many people say, oh, it's a polytheistic religion. Well, what's funny is that their primordial revelation is called the Song of God. And there are multiple pathways to God. And one of them is through deeds, love, and wisdom, and through intelligence, basically. The heart path is the fastest way, and the intelligence path is the longest way. And I feel like there's a case for universality here, but yeah, it's there's hints in the Quran about what a believer actually is. And one of the verses talks about how God sent something down to affirm what they already knew, and they chose to deny it. So and this is repeated multiple times, and even the people that claim they believe in Islam, there's a verse saying, oh, there'll be people that say they believe in God and worship and all that, but they're actually unbelievers. So that means there's actual unbelievers within Islam itself, and then there's unbelievers that know something is the truth and still reject it. So the whole predication of what an unbeliever is, and I feel like people don't talk about this, is that actually an unbeliever is somebody that knows it's the truth and still chooses to reject it. It's not that they don't know it's true. It's that they know to the deepest core of themselves that it's true, and they still reject it. So, and there's also a verse in the Quran where it talks about the Jews and the Christians. They'll be, if they worship me, they'll be safe on Judgment Day. And a lot of Muslims try to extract this and say, well, those were the Christians that historically accepted Islam because they affirmed the scriptures and so on and so on. I'm like, okay, first of all, there's so many problems, because if you take like a philosophy of history seriously, you're not even questioning that. But if you look at the combination of verses between what it talks about for believers, what are the predications for believers, and so on, is that actually, if you find any revelation that your heart is inclined to and is the truth, then and if you reject it, then you are actually an unbeliever. And I think for some reason this has been like distorted for centuries, because I've been reading the Quran recently, and I'm like, wow, this is some bullshit.
Yeah, I suppose I guess people's reasons for not believing are quite interesting anyway, because I feel like we know this philosophically speaking, I think, is that you kind of have to go out on a limb and believe something, right? You kind of have to go out on a limb because you're always going to have doubts, right? You're always going to have doubts. You have to believe in something, right? And I feel like there's like reason for this. Well, like well, I can't fit this theology into my rationality, all these sorts of denial. I'm just wondering if Islam has a concept of false idols in the same way that Christianity does. Do you know? Because that rationality is almost like a false idol, right?
Yeah, no, you're right. it is, but like there's my favorite verse called like it's in the Quran. It says, "Worship your Lord until certainty comes to you."
Mm.
Now, this has been translated as, worship your Lord until your time of death comes to you. But I don't think it has to actually mean that. I think there is this idea that even if you do believe, obviously there's still obscure doubts, but it's this idea of you have to ontologically thrust yourself into the direction of the absolute. And yeah, it's kind of a gamble. But for Islam, basically, there's a lot of things that are idols for Islam. I, I it's hard to like get into this, but like basically, if you're not like in some severe way, if you're not remembering God, you're basically taking an idol. Like if you're, for example, like the Islam is very big on the eyes. If you look at a woman, like first of all, you shouldn't even look at a woman that you're not married to, because it's that severe in terms of just like that you might do something, and you might sin and so on. But yeah, if you take any anthropomorphic being so high that you forget God, you've made it your idol. Because for Muslims, again, God is so absolute that you can't even fathom it. So basically, whatever somehow if you thrust anything before that, you're having essentially an idol. You're not believing in God as absolute, and that's why you could say they have a problem with Jesus, as Christians say, like, as as the Son of God. They have problems with that because they would say, "Oh, well, you are worshiping him as God when God is only so absolute that you can't even know him." So, and this is the contention that they always have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's interesting how I think this is my understanding from what I've read anyway, is that Islam doesn't have, in the full story, doesn't have kind of like, the part about Adam and Eve realizing that they are actually naked in the Garden of Eden and kind of covering themselves, like kind of discovering shame in a way. And it's interesting how, I again, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but Islam doesn't have that sort of metaphor in the like actual scripture, but has a like you just mentioned, has a very similar, almost like instantiation of shame into, I would say shame, you know what I mean, like you said, like not looking at something that could be potentially a sin. It's interesting how that's like kind of transfigured from a metaphor into law in Islam. I don't know if that's correct or what you understand, but
I have to find it again, because I remember I looked up all the verses where it talks about the fall. I want to say there's one that talks about like the fig leaf, but I'm not 100% certain. And yeah, I think I think if they embrace the idea of shame, then you're embracing the idea of like the original sin, and then it carries on. I think maybe that's why it wouldn't be brought up in that. But what's interesting about Iqbal's interpretation is that he says that their eyes opening and realizing that they're naked is the rising of consciousness. Which is, I mean, I'm actually kind of more sympathetic towards that description, where it's actually us. That he kind of does this irony where it's like, yeah, you if you think of it like a womb, like Garden of Eden is like kind of like a womb, everything's perfect. You're being sustained. You don't have to do anything for your being. And then all of a sudden you get shot out, like being birthed to, and now you're vulnerable. Now you're naked. But at the same time, you're also rising to consciousness. You're opening your eyes. You're moving your arms, which I thought it was a fascinating kind of interpretation from his perspective. I'll tell you right now, no Muslim has told me that. but, but I am kind of sympathetic to that interpretation. Because it, again, for some reason, I'm kind of against taking views of just like this. And I think Daniel and me talked about this too, is that a lot of people mourn the idea of like, oh, we fell, but we have to go back. And Daniel told me actually this whole fascination about the returning to Garden of Eden is just it's just a cultural thing, because from Daniel's understanding of Christianity is that you're supposed to find the new Jerusalem. And Islam also, it's said multiple times in the Quran that God made man to become sovereign on earth, except we've proven to be so inadequate. Like the whole idea of God making us is that we made a promise that we would be sovereigns on this land, and nobody else wanted to take the responsibility, right? It says in the Quran, like, not even the mountains wanted to take the responsibility. Not even anything else wanted to take the responsibility. We took it, but we've been heedless with it. And so on.
Yeah, it reminds me of the part in Genesis where it's well, this is less of a sort of responsibility of like that man takes up, but God kind of hands down the dominion over, fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, all that sort of stuff, to man. So I'm not sure how that differs, or whether that's basically the same meaning.
I mean, I don't think it differs, honestly.
Sorry?
I mean, like I said, I don't think it differs. I think I would say me and Daniel's understanding of like man's supposed to mean like some type of sovereign, taking control of something, of what God hands down. I think that's the same. Yeah.
And that's something that stuck out to me with Iqbal, to be honest, is him sort of pointing out that freedom is as he calls it, a condition for goodness. And it's interesting because that coincides, maybe this is a little bit off topic, but it coincides with a lot of the philosophical views around determinism. I think there was a lot of those sort of philosophically deterministic viewpoints almost imply a relativism by nature of the fact that no one's really making any decisions, right? And it's almost, as if, I don't know if this coincides with the Islamic view, but the whole idea of like a complete freedom that we've been given almost implies the fact that every single action we take is like a decision to either, like you said, ignore the truth as is made evident, or actually do good.
Yeah, I mean it's basically, you could say our freedom lies in the fact of, because it says in the Quran, God basically made us to praise him. We're the only creatures that have the ability to not do that, which makes us superior and also lesser than everything else at the same time. But we can become so basically like transcendent, because we can get extremely close to God if we conform to his will, if we conform to what he wants, and if we direct our will towards him. But yeah, the predestination part is is always interesting because I think was it Schuon says right here in Predestination, he says, free to the relative extent he is made in the image of God. So the way I understand it is you're free to the point that God allows you to, make whatever you're making, doing whatever you're doing. But yeah, I mean, for me, I used to be kind of ambivalent. Well, I used to kind of hate the idea of predeterminism because a lot of Muslims talk about this too. They're like, well, if I'm predestined to be a sinner, right? Well, then what the hell's the point of all this, right? But I think the point. I think the thing is that you can change that, in my opinion. It's just that, I quoted that thing from Iqbal, right? About there's a man praying for a different circumstance. Iqbal says, I don't pray that your destiny changes. I pray that you change. So I feel like that's a very significant understanding. The predestination is that we all return to God, regardless. Whatever we do, we return to God. That's the whole, that's the whole predestination point. The question is, how do you want to return to God? And that has to do with internal states, what you've been doing. And from the Sufi conception, it's what face of God do you want to see? And it's actually predicated on what you've been doing. If you've been a horrible human being, you're going to see a horrible face, and so on and so on. So it's self-reflective.
Yeah, speaking of the Sufi perspective, and this is again something that you'll just have to educate me on because I'm, hear these things through osmosis. But what do you think of the Mecca? I think this is right. If the place names, I may be messing this up. The Mecca Medina split in what Muhammad was saying.
I feel like
is there much to that? Is there much to that? Because
I vaguely. So what is it that you're trying to understand for the Medina and Mecca split? Because there's a time period where he gets kicked out, and he has to establish somewhere else, which I believe is Medina.
Yeah.
And then he gets revelations, and then he's able to take back Mecca. Again, that's kind of like what I understand, but I'm kind of, I guess, what's from what aspect of the split are you trying to understand?
Right, so I've heard that kind of the first half, which I believe is the what is kind of focused on by Sufis is a more peaceful understanding of Muhammad as a figure, and then later on, almost by necessity of having to go back and conquer, the interpretations can get more, I guess you would say, extreme or violent. I don't know if there's, again, I would really like to know if there's any truth to that, really.
So yeah, it's if we take the Quranic verses, so Muhammad was postponing the battle or taking back of Mecca for a long time because God hadn't given him any revelation to say go and take it. So he had been remaining kind of peaceful. It wasn't until he finally got a verse that said something along the lines of, I'm going to summarize here. It basically says if they aggress upon you, then you have every right to go on them. And it's funny because some people like to take this so out of context when it's there's some specific verses that are very, very historical, because the revelation of the Quran didn't happen in one sitting. It happened over a period of time, and and specific verses would be revealed when Muhammad was going through specific aspects of his life, and the ones with like, you know, actually fight them and so on. This kind of goes into when the Quraysh, I think that's kind of how you pronounce it, the Quraysh were imposing on them, or God gave, you know, Muhammad finally permission and so on. So yeah, I know that's one of those things that a lot of people have hard times grappling with. They're like, wait a second, like, isn't this supposed to be like some kind of like peaceful thing, like Islam's about peace and so on? But I think I I think, I mean, I don't know. The way I look at it is kind of like, well, it's really hard to have peace if there's people imposing on you, if that's the perspective you want to take it. So I don't know. I think either there's some naive versions of peace, because what is it? I was talking to my friend Chitan, he's like, actually the whole idea of nonviolence is you actually have to go through the violence in order to get peace. But I think that's a lot of the things that theologians won't spend time talking about too much. They'll be like, oh yeah, well, you know, they'll just give you some fluff and you either accept it or you don't. So
you get similar things happening with Christianity, because obviously you have the duality of Christ the Lamb, and there's also Christ the Lion, right? His doctrine is one of general peace and meekness, but also there are some very specific parts which are at least violent in language, like saying that he also comes with a sword. And then obviously you have the specific instance, which is, I don't know, probably my favorite part is the sort of temper tantrum in the temple with the money lady.
Yes.
And also just all of his interactions with the Pharisees, who, you know, they make a false idol of strange hygiene rituals, and they wear strange garments because they've just kind of invented these things, and it's not from scripture. I don't know if does Islam have a in the Quran, are there similar parables to that, those sorts of things?
There are similar parables. It's actually very surprising that I mean, well, at least when I first read it, I was surprised that there is a lot of similar parables, but there's also strikingly a lot of different parables, which was honestly like really fascinating, because, you know, one of my favorite stories, and I think I already told you, was the one with Moses and Khidr, where apparently Moses talks about, he kind of apparently brags that he's like one of the most intelligent prophets, and God kind of, out of like, to kind of keep him in check, goes, okay, well, you're going to see my other prophet that I've blessed with more intelligence than you. And so the whole parable begins with that interaction, which is, I always love it, because Khidr is someone that actually breaks, you know, anybody that like would follow the law T by T would be like, whoa, what are you doing? Like, you just killed somebody, you just like broke this guy's boat, and so on and so on. And Khidr's just like, I told you to have patience and you couldn't bear it, so I'm going to tell you what you didn't understand. And it's one of my favorite parables. But yeah, they're similar. And I think this is again why I kind of have a hunch that a lot of the parables in the Bible are still like valid, because it doesn't bring those parables back into the Quran and like change them a little bit. It doesn't do that. So I'm assuming like they're perfectly fine, because again, the Quran is meant to come in and affirm the scriptures. So I do feel like it's kind of hard to determine like exactly like, oh, this is completely omitted, or it's actually true and that's why it's not added on. You know, so I do feel like a lot of what the Quran tries to correct it actually explicitly states in the Quran itself. Because like the whole thing about Jesus is like the huge debacle. So it definitely talks about that.
Sorry, this is the debacle of him being understood as God's form on earth or God's son. Is that what you're referring
Yeah. It's well, it's Jesus being sacrificed, one. But I was reading a couple translations and commentaries about this, and it seems that from a Christian perspective, obviously there's room to debate, but I was reading the commentary about it, and it seems like the reason why the Quran and God is so angry in this instance is because the Jews were being proud of themselves that they killed a messenger of God. That they killed somebody close to God. And so the Quran is kind of like using harsh words against those specific people, thinking that they actually killed Jesus. So it's like the inverse, right? It's more like it's upset at the Jews who were laughing, thinking that they killed Jesus. So that's it. Just like it attacks the other side. It doesn't attack Christianity actually directly in these couple verses. It actually attacks the Jews for thinking that they did kill him.
Yes, I mean, in terms of the Quran being, as you said, correction, but also and again, correct me on this if I'm wrong, but the final message, you kind of, like, this is it, this is the truth, and there's nothing that comes after this. What are some, do you know any other notable examples of specific things from maybe the Bible or Torah that are explicitly sort of rebutted or corrected in the Quran?
I don't know, actually, because I haven't read like the Bible completely. But I know, like, when I was a kid and I was told all the stories of the Bible and stuff, that it doesn't, I mean, it seems like a lot of it is just, I mean, if I were to be fair, I mean, there's some, okay, so Mary is one of those things. I don't remember seeing Joseph's name. There's this weird story about Mary being at a tree, like leaning on a tree, and she's kind of like very sad. And I think Angel Gabriel comes in and like comforts her. And I think this is before she was told that she was gonna carry Jesus. And then of course there's that there's that aspect where Jesus talks as a baby in the Quran.
Yes.
Which I always forget, but yeah, it's in there. It's in there. And that's a kind of like a very noticeable difference. And then also the idea of Muhammad splitting the moon is also one miracle that a lot of Muslims take seriously.
Yeah. On the subject of baby Jesus, is the I think it's the Gnostic Apocrypha, right? It's kind of like the other books that were written but not accepted canonically, but are, strange sects kind of, subscribe to them. There's like a couple of books about the young Jesus, like him as a kid going around and doing stuff. And I mean, I really need to read them because they sound quite funny, but basically he does like loads of quite horrible things and doesn't really learn anything from it. Like, he's just kind of showing off with his powers, basically. So like the complete opposite of the temptation in the desert. Like he gets bullied, so he gets God to punish some other kids or something like this. Like really wild stuff. But yeah, I need to look into that and read those.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because like some Muslims will be like, yeah, well, the Christians, they've hidden some, books of the Bible because it actually shows Jesus talking as a baby. It actually shows Jesus like taking clay and like them turning into doves or whatever, or like birds. And I'm just like, I mean, I think there is one gospel that actually does, like one rejected gospel that actually talks about Jesus like taking clay and like throwing into birds. Um, so, and again, it's interesting because it kind of, when you start reading the Quran, you start getting like fed the idea that like all Christians did, like the ones that were like the sort of higher hierarchy, like Christian theologians, all they did was like distort the Bible and kind of just like hide things from people. And it got so distorted that, you know, it had to be basically corrected. And that's kind of like the narrative that the Quran feeds, that it just got distorted. And so it comes in to affirm what was correct and reject what was wrong. Yeah. And that's obviously a lot of pills to swallow if we want to accept it or reject it, right? And yeah.
Yeah, I know someone who is quite devoutly religious, but is now going on to study the like specific historical, like and archaeological origins of the Bible, basically. And she was describing to me how it's like a really difficult thing to, oh, I want to go deeper into this thing, but I'm possibly going to find out some things that are going to shake my faith, and also kind of well, you know, exactly, that's it, you know, like you might learn something historical or archaeological, and there is things like this where, you know, word is moved around and all these sorts, and you know, books are like some parts are hidden, all these sorts of things. So yeah, I don't know, it's a tricky subject if you're a professed believer, but I think what I take from the Fall as someone who, I think I would call myself like religious curious, maybe, but I basically see it as a kind of explanation, maybe cope perhaps, for the fact that we are we're fallible creatures, and we are limited in our natures. We're limited by that fallibility, and also the fact that, you know, on this earth at least, we're not going to live forever, or at least that's what that story professes. I'm not sure if you kind of agree with that interpretation, but that's kind of what I've taken from it. Is it's kind of an acceptance of our limitations, basically.
No, I mean, I agree. I mean, I don't think Muslims would disagree on that either. I think what is actually ironically, you could say, kind of like soothing when I'm reading books like these, either the Bible or just religious texts in general, is that when you face something in your life and you get like that weird hit of like the void, right? I'm just gonna put it like, when you just like encounter that void,
Yeah.
and you're like, bro, all of this is meaningless. Like, is, you know, for example, like you'll have questions in your head like, okay, I'm doing all this work and eventually it's just gonna mean nothing. You know, I could be famous, I could not be famous, but why would I drive myself crazy thinking about whether I am gonna be or not? And then, you know, there's just all these things that you start thinking about, like, am I doing enough in life? And when you read the Bible or the Quran, it just has just simple things that anybody could have a good life if you just pray, if you just do good. I am fascinated with just the simplicity of being told just to love and do good and accept the limits of your capabilities. And the Quran talks about this too, right? There's some people that I have blessed more than others, but don't get greedy about what you didn't have, or, you know, so it could be that, yeah, you're right, maybe I'm not smart enough, maybe I am not all these other things, But what I can do, and what everybody always can do, is do good, is, love and pray. And so for some reason, I find that to be the incredible kind of like outlet when because I think really when you do get hit with the void, it really shows you like how empty a lot of the things that we do. Mm-hmm. When you get those like moments of just like pure sadness, you're just like, what am I doing? I don't understand. Mm-hmm. Nothing seems satisfactory. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's kind of like the perspective I take.
Yeah. I think the beauty of these things which have endured, like the scriptures of Christianity or the Quran, is that, like you said, there is a simple message to them, but there's also depth as well, which is why they've endured, is because they can appeal to you in whether you're feeling like you're in an intellectual mood or whether you're in a kind of hopeless mood. You can get a simple or a complex message. Again, each to their ability. Some people have a different way of understanding things and a different capacity for understanding things. I think that's kind of why I'm not willing just to go, the atheistic route and just jettison these myself. I think there's going to be utility in these sorts of things as long as there's human beings, basically.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's funny because like I can't accept the nihilistic perspective just because it just assumes that you actually understand these texts. When historically you have to throw your whole being into these texts. You have it's not like you can just open a book and read it. It's not like that. A lot of these so-called revelations, there's kids, if we're talking about like Bhagavad Gita, there's kids that would have to meditate hours on just one single line of the Bhagavad Gita. Okay. And it's that kind of ontological participation that people don't, and this is again some of my beef, is that actually we've gotten accustomed to just intellectually thinking about texts and so on, but I think it's necessary for some people's natures, which mine and yours, but also it requires an ontological just fullness. You have to throw yourself completely in if you really do want to understand. So like, because I get so fascinated, sometimes I'm like, yeah, I will pray. I will sort of ontologically thrust myself in, because if I have always some type of reservations, then I'm clogging myself up, And lately, just kind of like as an experiment, I just been, praying, meditating, kind of throwing myself in it. And it's just fascinating because I feel like I'm understanding more. But I feel like I'm understanding a picture, an interpretation of the Quran that is more universal, more accepting, more loving. And like the Sufi says, the verses of the Quran, there's so much depth to them. There's like a multiplicity of meanings within one verse. And ever since they said that, I've been fascinated with understanding that, because if that means that there's a multiplicity of meanings, the way I understand this is that according to my ontological receptivity, according to what I give, I get back. Yes. So if I'm willing to have a superficial reading, then I will get a superficial reading.
Right.
And that's how I take it. So I am not satisfied with just throwing that away and accepting nihilism, because I haven't completed the work.
And this is one of the kind of realizations I had about Christianity that sort of comes from, looking at the Christians in my life and realizing that there are certain fruits to their belief and their practice. And again, this is exactly what you've just said, is I'm wondering what it says about this in the Quran, but this is repeated in the Bible a lot, and it's kind of a response to any skepticism. It's like, well, take these tenets and put them into practice and you'll see the results.
It actually, ironically, the Quran says something like, there's kind of like a verse that I like. It's titled "The Unbelievers," but it says, "I'll believe what I believe, and you'll believe what you believe," and it kind of keeps going down like that. And I always find it funny because the Quran kind of accepts this idea of you can't convince anybody about any belief. And it even says that you shouldn't even try to convince people. If they're not already inclined to it, then they're going to continue believing what they believe. But it does kind of promote this idea of seeking knowledge.
Yeah.
The Quran really emphasizes the idea of seeking knowledge. And it always says, if you want knowledge, ask me for it. Allah says, ask me for it. If you want knowledge, ask me. And continue seeking as such. So this idea of knowledge is you could say this is the ontological practice, is that you have to ask God for knowledge. You can't just do it on your own. So it's not the same, but it's similar. It requires a sort of ontological participation.
Yeah. Anyway, on the topic of seeking knowledge, your YouTube channel is pretty prolific. Like, you'll be having a lot of conversations on there, a lot of just talking to the camera about what you've been reading and studying. We've kind of ended up in a particular circle on the internet. I'm just kind of wondering, what have you studied these topics formally in the past? Like, what sort of set you off or to doing what you're studying and what you're putting out on YouTube? And
well, so there's one big event in my life. One was when I deployed to Afghanistan, and then kind of like before Afghanistan. Ironically, I came from a Christian background, right? But the thing is, I never really practiced it. So it was kind of empty. And if I would go to church, I would just go to church just to please my mother. So eventually I got to the army and I realized like kind of how empty this whole idea of saying that I'm a Christian. I started becoming really unsatisfied with the fact that I always tell people I'm a Christian, but I don't really do anything to say or, to embody that fact. So I kind of just threw that away. And then I accepted it's funny, I quickly accepted an atheist position. But then I ironically got really curious with Buddhism and Hinduism. And I kind of read like the Dhammapada, which is the Buddhist scripture, and the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu scripture. And it's funny, the book that actually set me on my journey from the beginning was Hermann Hesse's Story About the Buddha. It's a fascinating story. I still think it's actually one of the books that began my journey into sort of religious curiosity. And then finally, around before deployment, I accepted Islam. But I think the problem with that was I was a little too hasty. Because when I got into Afghanistan, I was really going through it, with my own religion in terms of like, do I actually believe it? This is too much for me, praying 5 times a day, doing all this stuff. I actually did Ramadan, fasting for a month. That was probably the most disciplined thing I've ever done. And it was really brutal on my body because I wasn't accustomed to it. Uh, but I was so obsessed with the law of it that it kind of drove me insane.
Mm.
And so by the time I got out of deployment, and then of course, being in the environment of deployment, COVID, it just really got to my mentality that I just dropped it when I got after deployment. I just dropped it completely. And then I got really curious. But the funny thing is, I read Iqbal in deployment, and I decided to read him again once I dropped it. And after that, I started getting curious because Iqbal brings up a lot of philosophers like Nietzsche, Carl Jung, and it just, ever since then, I got into that loophole. Mm. And then I just never stopped, really, So I started realizing that, one, I really like psychoanalysis, I like philosophy, I like learning about religions. I learned a lot about myself through the whole kind of like period of despair. And then now I'm just kind of like, I don't know, it's weird. I think somebody said, you're just like in your corner doing your own thing, man. And I kind of embrace that fact. I'm like, yeah, I'm just in my corner, just doing my own thing.
Yeah. But yeah, I think knowing yourself is a powerful thing, and it seems like that's kind of the direction you're moving in. But yeah, cool. So some of these conversations get a bit serious at times. So I kind of like to end up with a kind of tongue-in-cheek question as a reminder not to take ourselves so seriously. If you were on death row, what would your final meal be?
Why would you tell? Oh, I know what it would be. Because I love Indian food, so it would have to be nice. Chicken masala rice and with the bread, obviously, and then basically a mango smoothie. Mm-hmm. That's it, man. I die happy like that. I have it down, man. I know exactly what I would eat.
Yeah, that's good. Some people are a bit confused by that question, but yeah, it's good. Okay, thanks, Javier.